Welcome everyone to our in-service for April. Um, so we have the Alzheimer's Association with us today. Mariah is here to present. I just want to run over a couple things really quick. Our May in-service is up here. May 22nd, noon and 2 p.m. This time it's going to be really neat. We have Melissa Davis's husband is going to present to us. He's a chaplain with Suncrest Hospice, and he's going to talk about caregiver boundaries and how to handle or how to deal with emotional grief when you're a caregiver. You know how we support the family and we get so close to our clients and then they're gone, and sometimes it's hard for us as caregivers to know how to how to handle that. We have to be strong for the family, and we're there to take care of everything when our hearts are breaking too. So he's going to come and talk to us about that. And then Caregiver Appreciation Day is May 6th from 10 to 3. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the time over to Mariah, and we're going to turn off the lights. And yeah.
Okay. And I have till 12:45.
You have till about 12:45.
Hey, wonderful. All right. Okay, well, thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. I hope I can share some helpful information for all of you, but I'd also love to hear any thoughts that you have or questions that you have. But to get started, I'm curious. I know that all of you are caregivers, but outside of professional work, have any of you cared for anyone in your family with Alzheimer's or dementia, or had any experience doing that? A little bit? Okay, so caregiving, it sounds like for most of you, is a newer experience. And I wonder if this rings true for you. Do you feel like caregiving is always intuitive, or it makes sense how to respond to dementia related behaviors and communication? Yeah, I feel the same way. It really does it, especially if it's someone you've known before or you've known them in different stages of the disease. Sometimes it's hard to know how to communicate with them. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how your communication will change with people living with Alzheimer's or dementia through the various stages, and also how their communication changes. We'll also talk about verbal and behavioral messages that might be trying to be communicated, and how to communicate, some tips for communicating in the different stages of Alzheimer's. One thing I think is important to note when thinking about communicating in Alzheimer's and dementia is that communication is much more than just verbal talking. And we can communicate in so many different ways, whether that is through the five senses, body language, or tone. There's so much that goes into communication, more than just our words. So there are 3 stages of Alzheimer's disease. There's the early stage, which is mild, the middle stage, which is moderate, and the late stage, which is severe. And the middle stage is where people typically are the longest when they have Alzheimer's disease. And so we're going to go through each of these phases more in detail and what those look like. So I won't spend a lot of time here. So let's start with talking about the early stage. The early stage of Alzheimer's is when people are typically aware that they have the disease. So they might have been diagnosed recently. They are aware that they're starting to struggle, and that can be very frustrating for them. And maybe you've seen this, right? They're aware that something is different in their brain, but they can't do anything to fix it, which is very frustrating. So what that might look like on their end is they might have a harder time finding the right words. You might see them grasping to find the exact word that they're looking for to communicate with you. It also might take them a little bit longer to communicate something than usual. And because of this, maybe they get a little self conscious and it makes them be more isolated or withdraw from conversations or just be more quiet than you would typically see them. And another thing that you might see along with this is struggling to make decision making or solve problems. And so, again, this can make them very self conscious because they are aware that these are things that they're struggling with. So, we're going to watch a video that talks a little bit more about this.
Communicating in the early stages of dementia with the person with the disease is important. At that time, you still have language as a tool, so you can learn things about what they might prefer as the disease progresses. For example, as the disease progresses, a person might have difficulty finding words. Caregivers often struggle to know what to do in that moment. Early on in the disease, you can ask. You can say, if you ever have trouble coming up with a word, would you rather that I jump in and give you the word, or do you want me to wait and allow you some time so you can find it on your own?
Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts about your or any experiences that you've seen with working with people in the early stages of dementia when they're still cognizant of what's happening and anything that's maybe helped you in those situations?
Well, I would say for my father-in-law, he's passed on, but he's an ex-Marine, so he I try to be really sensitive to his dignity and not wanting to feel so vulnerable. Like that was really hard for him, and so sometimes I would just try to make him at ease. It's okay, you're where you're at, and we love you, and you're all good. And but like just the last days, he kind of was resistive of I brought my violin and played for him, and we were singing songs, and that was just like way out of his comfort zone. But you know what? It really loosened him up, and we could just kind of talk him through stuff like that. And my mom, I was just going to mention her because maybe she has a little dementia, but it's more stroke.
Okay.
But it still applies with communication,
Sure.
because some things are just below like her dignity in some ways, like pushing buttons for different things. She just rather, and you kind of have to watch her to see if she'll just do a little quick nod or, like the nonverbal just to really cue into her. So it really helps her to feel secure to have people that can flow with that and kind of anticipate her needs.
Thank you for sharing that. One thing that you touched on that I think is really important to remember is in these early stages, you might see some of the people you're interacting with be in denial about the disease, right? That's very difficult. And of course, they are facing this diagnosis that is scary to them. They don't know how it's going to affect them. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think the more validating you can be that we still love you, there's nothing wrong with you, as validating as you can be, especially when they are in denial, is really helpful. And just giving them a place to talk about those feelings, even if they're uncomfortable and they're experiencing some anger or frustration, it's important to be able to be a validating person to them.
I mean, the grieving, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just the grieving steps still apply because they're grieving something they don't even know. And if you can help them place that and just say, well, this is where, it's okay. This is the normal part of life, and we're here for you.
Thank you. That is a great tip because there is a lot of grief involved for everyone with this type of diagnosis, right? And we don't want to forget the person who actually has the disease that they're also upset. So some tips that we have for communicating with those in the early stages. As it said in the video, what's great about this stage is you can still use verbal communication. So one thing that we would suggest is being really direct in what you're asking, not beating around the bush, but as direct and simple as your language can be, the better. So if you can keep sentences short, that's very helpful. And also making sure that you're not rushing through communication, either yours or theirs. If they're trying to communicate something to you, or if you need to communicate something, maybe speaking a little more slowly just shorter sentences in general can be very helpful for them. It's also important to remember that Alzheimer's affects every person differently, right? And so we never want to make assumptions about what a person can or can't do, or what they can and can't understand. And I say that to make sure that we never want to exclude someone in the early stages from conversations, because that just makes them feel even worse about what they're experiencing. But maybe asking them how they want to be included, or if they do want to be included, is very important. And so again, not making assumptions about what they are capable of as a person in the early stages, because it does look different person to person. Which also means that it's good to ask, how would you prefer to communicate? What works best for you? Do you want to talk on the phone? Do you like email? Do you want to talk in person? And so finding out what they are capable of, but also what they prefer, is very, very helpful. Also, remembering to speak directly to the person, not just about them, to the people around them, is extremely important. Trying to laugh together as much as you can is very important, especially, in this hard phase where they might be struggling with these difficult feelings. And then also remembering to stay connected with them. The last thing someone with Alzheimer's needs is to feel isolated or excluded. And so anything you can do to include them in ways they're capable of is really important. Okay, so before I move on to our next stage here, any questions or thoughts about the early stage? Yes.
My only other thought with communication was that, like, we speak directly and make small sentences or whatever, but giving one task at a time.
That's great.
Like, don't tell them, okay, we're gonna do this, 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 and this. It's one thing at a time, and make sure that they understand that one thing at a time.
Thank you for sharing that tip. That is so helpful. And I agree. The less you can overwhelm the person, the better. Any other thoughts or questions about the early stage before we move on?
I'm not sure if it's this stage or later stages, but with the clients that I've had, I find myself apologizing a lot.
Okay.
And taking on a lot of what they like. If they make a mistake, I'll try to make it be like it was my fault. You know what I mean?
So they feel less distressed.
So they feel like
or embarrassed.
Yeah, or if they're getting angry, even though it's not my fault. I just, because my father-in-law seemed to be stuck in this stage a long time.
Okay.
And he would get so frustrated and it couldn't be him that was doing things wrong. So we just were like, oh yeah, I'm so sorry. And it just kind of took a little bit of the edge off. And even though I think deep down he knew it was him, and that's what was so sad about it. So the more blame we could, or you know what I mean, the more we could buffer that and just say, oh, I'm so sorry, I did this and I forgot that. And it seemed to kind of bring down his stress level.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a great way to be comforting and validating, even if it doesn't completely make sense, which we'll talk more about. I'm sure you all have to say and do things that don't always make sense to you in caregiving, but if it makes the person feel more safe or comfortable, it's even better. Yes.
Well, that can be a double-edged sword too. I mean, sometimes being soft like that, sometimes they'll unleash more on you.
Sure.
And so helping with boundaries, just asserting and
being okay with boundaries, and
yes.
But also feeling it out, like doing that in that situation is perfect, And I do that with Joan this morning. She went in the other room. I didn't realize she was wanting me to follow her with this thing that we had just packed, and so I'm fine with taking it. But sometimes some people are used to just leaning in on you, and we have to have healthy boundaries too. So
thank you for that. And I think it does go back to each person is so different with the disease, and one thing that works for someone might not work for the other person, which also makes caregiving difficult, right? Is understanding what works best for them, but also definitely taking care of yourself and setting those boundaries is important as well. Thank you for those wonderful comments. Let's talk about the middle stage. This is probably the stage you're most familiar with. I'm not sure. Mostly, we've just found that people stay in this stage typically the longest in their progression of the disease. So, what does the middle stage of Alzheimer's look like? And I do want to say a disclaimer. Sometimes it can be difficult to tell which stage people are in, right? So don't feel like you have to be an expert on this. But what you'll see in the middle stage is even more difficulty finding the right word. And because of that, they might make up words to replace familiar words or familiar objects. It sounds like you've seen that before. And so that is something you might see them using words you've never heard before to describe things, getting lost with their train of thought, maybe talking less. And again, that could come from that embarrassment or even just because it's difficult to speak. And also trying to sometimes get your attention or communicate something through behavior more than their words because they are struggling with their words. So those are some things that you might see. And as it says on here, it's always good to talk to your doctor if you see a sudden dramatic shift in behavior or communication, which you might see at some point. Okay, got another little clip here to watch.
I would advise couples, and I usually do advise the caregiver who comes to the group and is caring for a spouse, that you take your time. Always count to 3 before you respond, because it gives you time to think about your answer and what's going on. Generally, in a marital dispute, it's quick. It's back and forth. You're quick to give an answer. When they've been diagnosed, to sit back and say, okay, you're supposed to be the one that's reasonable here. Let's change how we do this, because there's only one thing you can control, and that's you. You cannot control them and their process.
I love her tip there to maybe take a pause before responding, especially in those situations where you're not exactly sure how to respond. Oops, so sorry about that. Move to the next slide here. Taking a pause can be really helpful. Some things you might also see in this stage that are a little bit different. You might see people reverting back to their native language is something you might see in this stage. You might also see someone using curse words more frequently. That might be something you've seen. Also, people maybe gesturing more instead of speaking. So those are some unique behaviors you might start to see in this stage, and it's just the individual trying to communicate in any way that they can, right? And so some important things to remember in this middle stage is to always approach someone from the front and not come, if you can help it, not come from the side or scare them in any way, but that can make them easily agitated. And then also identifying yourself can be really helpful in this stage so they know who you are, your relationship to them. Using their name so that they know that you're a familiar person to them can be extremely helpful. Any eye contact you can maintain with them, or even sometimes getting down on their eye level if they're sitting down, can be helpful. I think this is probably the most difficult thing about caregiving, this next bullet point, is trying not to criticize or correct someone. This is the part that I'm talking about that is not intuitive, right? If the person that you're taking care of says something that just maybe sounds crazy to you, it's so easy to want to say, that's not true, that's not how it is, and correct them. But as you've probably seen, that doesn't really make it better, does it? It makes them a lot more agitated or more frustrated. And it's hard to remember, again, especially if you have known this person before they were in this stage and what they used to be like. It's hard to remember that they're living in a different reality than you are, right? And they're probably going to say some things that just don't make sense to you. Paying attention to your tone, and as the woman said in the video, maybe if you are feeling frustrated because they are saying something that doesn't make sense to you or is strange, taking a pause before you respond to make sure you have a very calm tone, and then taking your time to communicate with them. Any thoughts or experiences that you have had that has been helpful for you in this stage where they are having a harder time communicating? Or how do you respond when someone says something that doesn't make sense, and what do you do in that situation? Have any of you ever experienced that before?
I had a client one time that she'd wake up and was sure that her daughter was missing. And so it was so hard to try to calm them down. And they always say, go to where they're at so you can try to help. But like, she wanted to call the police. Her husband had Parkinson's, and she'd try to wake him up and get him up to go help search. And in that case, all we could do was medicate. It was just so hard. And to try to comfort her. And she'd say, you can't have kids because you just can't understand how this feels. So, when they're that unreasonable and agitated, it was so hard to it was heartbreaking because all you could do was medicate and try to be there to calm them. But then she'd wake up in the same state, so that was really hard. But it's like, I couldn't argue with her. You can't criticize what she's saying, but still it was so out there that it was really hard to deal with.
Sure.
How did she handle the medicating?
That was hard because you had to sit with her, and she would say, we have to go find her. We have to, it was just a constant. She was so riled up that it was so hard to calm her down, and it was the medication that put her to sleep, but then she'd wake up in the same agitated state.
Wow.
So it was really hard.
And how do you deal with, as a caregiver, when someone says something unkind to you, or her saying,
well,
you
can't
understand
take
this.
It personally. You just have to try to say, I can understand how you would feel, and try to calm it down that way. But she really thought her daughter was missing.
Sure.
And so it was every evening. She'd wake up, she'd go to sleep for a half hour and wake up and be this way. So it was one of the hardest cases I'd ever had to deal with.
That is so extremely difficult. And you had to, it sounds like, do things that you haven't had to do with other situations.
Right. We even walked around the yard at night, for her to be able to look and see and say, okay, we've done that.
Wow.
And then she'd say, you've got to call the police. Well, what do? You can't call the police.
Right.
But I'd call a son, and but then she was back there where her kids were young, and so she wouldn't believe she was talking to her children.
That makes sense.
And even talking to the daughter that she thought was gone.
Wow.
Was really hard. So that was hard because you do mental gymnastics in your mind, trying to figure out how
do I respond to this?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is an extremely difficult situation. And a lot of those situations are so sad because you do realize they're in distress. This is their reality. How hard would it be to wake up every day and feel that terrifying feeling? I think also, and I say this delicately, I think it's okay sometimes to have a sense of humor about the things that people say, right? And it's not that you're making fun of them, but you really do have to be able to laugh through certain situations, and have a sense of humor about it, because caregiving is extremely difficult, and it can really wear on you. So anytime you can find a sense of humor about it, I think is helpful. I know someone who took care of his mom for a long time with Alzheimer's, and there was a certain time of day where she would hallucinate hearing the national anthem at the same time every day. And at first, it was really frustrating to him, but he just learned to laugh about it because it was just a quirk that she had. Okay, let's watch this next clip.
Frustration. Because occasionally I would lose my patience and I would bark at her. Why are you asking me that question again? I just answered that question 2 minutes ago. And then she would get frustrated because, she was very old school and she's like, don't disrespect me. And I didn't ask you that question 2 minutes ago. It's a new question. So phase 2 of our relationship was like, okay, that's a new question. I'll answer it again.
Okay, so that is a common thing that you will be facing in this phase.
She could sense my frustration.
I don't know how to go to the next slide without playing it again. We'll figure that out. Okay, thank you. And so most likely you will see repeated words, questions in this phase, and it can be very frustrating. And so the best tip I have for that, I guess, is just taking a pause when you can, remembering that it is frustrating. Anything you need to do to feel in a more calm place to respond, because you will get a lot of repeated phrases and words and questions in this phase. And so remembering in this phase, our tips for communicating is really making sure that you're assessing the person's needs. Why is it that they're agitated? Is it physical discomfort? Is it something that's going on emotionally? What's happening for them that they would be in distress? Making sure that you understand their concerns, again, even if they don't make sense to you, but being validating instead of criticizing is extremely important. And you might see these their distress in the way that they're communicating or gestures or behaviors, but when you're around someone long enough, you can tell when there's something wrong or when they're upset. Then providing as short of an answer as you can, not an overly long explanation, so that they don't get lost in that, is very helpful. And then remembering to respond to the emotions behind whatever it is they're saying, especially if they say something hurtful or that doesn't make sense. What is it that they're feeling? And can you talk about that and be validating and address that emotion first? Also remembering, just like with the early stage, using short sentences and very basic words is extremely important. Speaking as slowly and clearly as you can, and one person and one question at a time, similar to talking about one task at a time. Just having one person talking to them at a time is extremely important. Any distractions that might make it difficult to communicate, whether that's a TV on in the room or music in the background, lots of people around, can make it more difficult to communicate. So that might mean you need to speak to them somewhere more quiet. And then being as patient as possible. And if you know it won't agitate them, trying to fill in words for them or guess what it is they are trying to say. Again, if you don't think it will agitate them, but if that's helpful, that's another thing that you can try. And so any questions or other thoughts, things that you found helpful in this stage? Yes.
So another thing that I think is to be aware of is to not talk about them in front of them. And they hear or they catch only part and understand only part of what you're saying. So if they catch a certain part but don't understand the meaning, like, they might catch we're looking at assisted livings, or not even thinking, and you may innocently mean we're going to visit someone in assisted living, but they're thinking they are looking for an assisted living for me, or they're, how they can just pick up on little. It's just important to not talk about things in front of them, that aren't that they might confuse.
Sure.
Also, don't talk about them, like over them.
Okay.
With other people, as if they're not there. If there's anything you don't want them to hear, just take it way out. And also, what I've found too is what is on TV matters, especially, and I don't know, mid stage is really long, and there's different levels in mid stage too.
Definitely.
But some of what they're watching can also, they can start confusing it with whether it's real or not. If it's a TV show that is violent, it can be really upsetting to them. So just be aware of their environment that way.
Thank you for those tips. I really appreciate that. And what I think you're speaking to is also remembering, and I know all of you are great at this because it's what you do, but that someone with dementia is still a person, right? With feelings and thoughts. And so being sensitive to what you say around them really does matter. I think, did you have a comment over here?
Yeah, my aunt lived in Pleasant Grove, and we were very close, and I visited her a lot. And she one day she drove me in her car, and she got onto Geneva Road right as a humongous truck was coming at us, and I'm going, Aunt Mary, you almost killed us. She really almost did. And then she oh, that wasn't me, that was him. And I'm going, so then her kids had to have that conversation about how do we take the keys away from her and all that. And then my mother had Alzheimer's, and she got more and more mean and aggressive, and she would start swearing, and she would never let us swear when we were growing up. And then she wore garments, thankfully, but she'd take everything else off and streak through the house. That was really shocking because we were raised in a super modest home. And, that was quite strange. And we had another incident. I had a friend that was in a nursing home that had been my next door neighbor for decades. And when I would go visit her, sometimes if I would start humming something or singing a song to the group, when the group of people, it was shocking. People that hadn't spoken a word in like ages, they would start singing the very words that were in that song. So it's like music is just one of the last things that seem to go. It's just really odd.
Yeah.
But they, so if you have somebody that likes that, that's one help. But sometimes people are agitated. Like if you I play the violin too, and if like you bring your violin or you play the piano, sometimes sounds can really agitate them. And I took care of a lady in Alpine when I first started in the company 20 years ago, and she would get agitated. She'd hit us and scratch us, and she would, if we went for a walk, sometimes she'd walk across 6 lanes of the highway in Alpine, not the freeway, and I finally told her daughter that day, I said, I'm sorry, but she, much as I love taking care of her, she needs to go in a memory care place because she got mad at me for, keeping her safe. And she just dashed across 6 lanes. And Alpine, that hill that goes down the hill before it gets to that roundabout where they decorate every Christmas. But anyway, and then we had a caregiver, Candace. I don't know if you remember Candace. And Candace had a bridal shower that night. And Barbara, she scratched her really deeply, all down her arm. And I said, Barbara, look what you did to her. She's having a bridal shower tonight. And now she's got to go with these scratches. And, anyway, it was just a little difficult sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those experiences, because I really think that every person is so different, and they don't always respond in the most kind ways, and it's hard to know how to respond and remain patient and not get frustrated.
I think the longer that the dementia and Alzheimer's goes on, the worse they fall into these violent behaviors. My grandfather was the same way. He started being more violent. He was never so affable, very loved.
And that's so hard to see, and that's why I think the families and the caregivers experience so much grief, right? Seeing the person that you care for being acting in ways that aren't true to who they are is very difficult. One thing I thought I forgot to mention, as far as speaking more clearly, it's helpful to remember not to offer too many choices to a person, which you've probably seen when you ask them their preferences on something, ask one thing at a time instead of open-ended questions, and that can be extremely helpful. And so just in this middle stage, remembering that sometimes visual cues can be very helpful, whether that's pointing or gesturing to something or showing an actual visual aid, such as a picture of something. Avoiding any sudden movement, which is why you want to approach someone from the front, and identify yourself because they can be easily startled. Maybe that's writing things down for the person to help them remember if you feel like that's helpful. You could put an answer into your question and repeat until maybe they have an answer. And I like this idea of turning negatives into positives. If there's something that the person you're caring for struggles with, finding a way to spin it into something positive, which you probably have also done with small children as well. So if it's something that, for example, they don't love having to take a shower, wording it is, we're going to get you cleaned up so that you can see this person later or do this thing, and help them see that what they're doing is helping them do something that they'd like to do. And then also avoiding quizzing them or asking them too many questions and expecting a response is extremely important. Most likely that will just make them more irritated. In this middle stage, it's important to join the person's reality, meaning just being validating of whatever it is that they're saying, even if it doesn't make sense to you, and being reassuring that you hear them, you understand what they're saying. Again, even if it sounds a little bit crazy to you, focusing on their feelings, not the facts of what's happening, and validating first and then redirect them if necessary, meaning that you always want to address the emotion before you try and distract them or change the topic, because that can make them feel less agitated or dehumanize them. So making sure you always respond to that emotion is really important. Okay, so now we're talking about the late stage of Alzheimer's here. And in this stage, it is very difficult for people to communicate with words. And so they might be using very few words at this point, or maybe some sounds to communicate how they're feeling. They might respond to some words or phrases that are familiar, but there's a lot less communication in this phase. And so it's very important for you to observe what their behaviors are, because they might be expressing that they're in pain or that they're uncomfortable. And this will be a lot more about their body language or their behaviors than their words. And so anything you can do to help the person feel more comfortable and that they're safe is extremely important. Remembering that even though someone's in this late stage, as they're progressing, to remember that they still need to be respected as a person, and to keep talking to them, because it's important that even if they can't respond, they know that you care about them. And this is where, in this stage, you might have to get a little bit creative and use more of the five senses to talk to them.
I know that my mom feels aggravated. I know that she feels alone. I know that she feels confused. And I know on any given day, I don't know if I've made it better for her. I try. In these later stages, I've come to recognize that being really aware of the five senses is really important. Touch seems to give her a great deal of comfort. I know when I come over, I'm going to brush her hair all the time. My husband noted to me recently, he said, you should see the look on your mom's face when you're brushing her hair. She's just happy. She's just happy. She doesn't say a lot. And I do it for a long period of time. I comb it, I braid it, I do funny things with it, but it just allows me to just be with her in a way that makes her feel comfortable.
I think that's such a sweet example. I love it whenever someone wants to brush my hair or play with my hair, so that definitely resonates with me. But that's such a beautiful way to be able to connect to this person who can't communicate with you. So if you do want to use the sense of touch, here's some ideas that you can use, and it maybe will take some creativity, but using different fabrics that are comfortable for them and having them feel them might bring them some comfort. A special blanket that they like could be helpful. Identifying shapes by having them touch it can be great. Massaging their hands with lotion can be helpful. Visiting with animals, if they feel comfortable with that, can be really great. Using Play-Doh to make a sculpture might be something they might enjoy, or just holding their hand or stroking their arm. Those simple forms of touch can be so helpful. As far as sight goes, pictures can be really helpful, not just of photo albums of people that they know, but maybe other things. They might like to look at pictures of animals or nature pictures, things that have brought them joy in their life. You can show them pictures of, which is beautiful. And maybe that is paintings as well, or people that they really respect and admire. It might also be a good idea to take them outside, go bird watching, or just even sit by the open window with them. And that can be a really beautiful thing. And if they still have the ability, trying to paint with them can be really wonderful as well. This was brought up earlier, but people with Alzheimer's respond very well to familiar music. And so maybe not everyone, but if you find that there is some music that really helps them feel calm, using that as a tool to connect with them by listening to music together. You could also listen to other sounds like nature sounds or animal sounds, anything that would be comfortable for them. Remembering if they do speak a native language or they've reverted back to that in the past, trying to play music or listen to things in that native language. Reading to the person can be really wonderful as well, even if they might not be comprehending it. Just trying to communicate with them and include them is really wonderful. And just remembering how much it can mean to them for them to hear your tone of voice and being gentle with them. Smell can also be an interesting way to communicate with people with Alzheimer's, and that might be having them smell different things like flowers that would bring them joy. There's an idea here of having cotton balls that have been dipped in essential oils. If you feel like certain smells like lavender might help them feel more calm. Maybe they love the smell of coffee or a certain tea, and that's something that you could remind them of and bring them joy through that way. And then also remembering to cook food for them that maybe has a really good smell that they love, something that they've really enjoyed in the past. And speaking of food, taste is a great way to connect with people. As we know, as people progress through this disease, it's harder and harder for them to eat, right? But with what they are able to, maybe that just looks like eating a popsicle or a drink that brings them joy, or ice cream, whatever it is they're capable of eating that brings them joy. And so just to summarize all of these stages, some important tips is remembering that even though it's not our reality that we're living in, it's that person's reality and it's very real for them. So anything you can do to validate that is so important. Remembering what to accept the person where they are, and that you can't change what phase they're in or help their brain at this point not progress. So accepting that. Remembering that this is still a person. They still have a sense of self. They still have things that they love that bring them joy and comfort, and respecting them. And doing all that you can to decode how they're communicating with you, whether it's through words or gestures or behaviors. There's so many different ways that we can communicate. Recognizing how your moods and actions affect the person and being aware of that. And then also anything you can do to soothe and calm the person. So we're going to skip this
Taking
one.
care of yourself while you care for somebody.
For the sake of time, we'll skip that. Although it's a great message that it's extremely important for caregivers to take care of themselves, of course, because it's not an easy job and it can weigh on you as well. So some resources we have available at the Alzheimer's Association that you're welcome to take advantage of is we have a 24/7 helpline that's open 365 days a year. They speak over 200 languages at the helpline, and you can call with any question of how do I respond to this behavior? Is this normal? What do I do in this situation? There's such a wonderful resource. So I highly recommend calling our support line. And I also have brochures up here with that number on it if it'd be helpful to share that with families, but also for yourself. We have all sorts of free education programs on alz.org that talk more about the warning signs of Alzheimer's and dementia, understanding it more, how to have dementia conversations, like how do we take our loved one's car keys away, those difficult things, legal and financial planning when someone in your family is diagnosed, and how do we go about that. Those are all free resources. And then lastly, we have our website that we created with AARP called communityresourcefinder.org, where you can find all sorts of resources for dementia and Alzheimer's by putting in your zip code, whether that's care in the community, different housing and assisted living options, caregiver support groups. It's all there. So just as I'm wrapping up, any final thoughts or questions about what we talked today, or tips you feel like would be helpful to share? Okay.
You did a good job. You covered it all.
Thanks. I know it's a lot of material to get through, but thank you for being here and for sharing your experiences and your tips. I think what's most helpful for caregivers is being able to talk to other caregivers and get those ideas of what is helpful. So thank you so much.
Oh, wrong light. Thank you so much for coming, Riot. Okay, we have this for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so are we going to videotape this next little part too?
No. So we can go ahead and turn this off.
Bye, everyone.